Zappa is infuriatingly unclassifiable, with experiments in music concrete, amelodic dissonance, shifting time signatures, the opening salvo to a long career, which all begins with Freak Out. This album is undoubtedly one of the most ambitious debuts in rock history. Freak Out was described by AllMusic as a seminal concept album that foreshadowed both art rock and punk at the same time, but it's an album that deconstructs rock conventions left and right, preferring to pitch its tent in territory inspired by those avant-garde composers, as well as effectively cocking a snoop at the Love Generation. And it's an album of two halves. The first half dedicated to catchy satirical pop rock songs, which posits the mother's invention, the very antithesis of teen idol bands and the whole freak culture, producing scathing satirical mockeries of the current music scene. The second half of the album, of course, is more experimental. As I've said, deals with elements of music concrete and sound effects. But nevertheless, they illustrate Freak Out's underlying principles of free individual expression. Freak Out contains the rudiments of everything that followed with Zappa ever afterwards, I think. It was infused with a sense of a kind of a cultural tremor that questioned what was artistically possible. Kaleidoscopic sounds, sneering parody, and vaudevillian bawdiness. Sounds like a great weekend, but nevertheless it was a wake-up call, I think, for American youth. Who were constantly bludgeoned with the musical mayhem of this album. One critic has said that this album interjects intelligence, a viral dose of intelligence, realism, and antagonism into pop. The album, whose concept has been described by Zappa as overall satirical. It is a record that introduces us to Susie Creamcheese, who informs us that the band are crazy and they smell bad. Although me describing this as a seminal album in rock history, it wasn't beloved by everybody. This is an album that looks to deconstruct popular culture. In fact, one critic said that it's a dialogue between rock and the changing experience of modernity in modern America. It's hugely experimental. It was experimenting with editing as well. Zappa was a huge fan of William Burroughs, and he certainly employed those techniques with this album. He certainly looked to rattle a few cages as well. He wanted to question everything, including the validity of his own art. This album was released on June 27, 1966 on the Verve label, and of course it criticised that burgeoning freak scene and subculture, something that Zappa was very suspicious of. Of course, Pete Townsend himself has said that the subculture was nothing more than youthful idealism and drug-fueled hope. One has to imagine that Frank and Pete would probably be on the same page there. But this album very much paves the way for the way music was developing towards the late 60s, before in the UK it merges into, some might say horribly, into progressive rock. That musical collage and avant-gardism and that cross-pollination of musical form. Certainly one can hear the presiding influence of composers like Edgar Varese, specifically his musical composition called Ionization. And the rhythmic melodies of Igor Stravinsky, which certainly haunt Zappa's work. This album did better in Europe than it did in America. I think Europe was more attuned to the strange weirdness that Zappa represented, more so than perhaps America were at the time. It was certainly very influential. McCartney was very taken with it. It hung over the Pepper sessions. The material on this album has been described as genre-shattering, which it certainly was. The band became the mothers of invention after Frank Zappa joined, of course. Before then, they were the Soul Giants. They were signed by Tom Wilson. The mothers consisted of Frank Zappa, Ray Collins, David Coronado, I think I've said his name right, Ray Hunt, Roy Estrada, Jimmy Carl Black, and Elliot Ingbar. Interestingly, Elliot Ingbar was dubbed the winged eel fingerling for the Captain Beefheart band. Went through several names. I think they were called the Batman at some point. They were even called, they switched to Captain Glasspack and his Magic Mufflers before deciding to call themselves the Mothers. The Mothers was a reference for top-notch musicians, motherfuckers in other words. The record company weren't too happy with this name and suggested they should be called the Mothers of Auxiliary. Frank Zappa eventually settled for the Mothers of Invention. The band certainly had an acerbic stage presence and weren't adverse to telling audiences where they could go. The band would eventually look to their band leader, the strange man in a goatee, Mother Superior.
Those coming through customs to get into your ridiculous country, they would have grabbed that film and smoked it before you ever got a chance to see it.
As I've said, Freak Out was a seismic moment in music history. Its blends of sounds, kaleidoscopic moods and sneering parody, as well as that vaudevillian jokiness, which would, some might say, pollute Zappa's albums ever afterwards. And, of course, he was the master of double entendre with his conversation with Susie Cream Cheese. Susie Cream Cheese, what's gotten into you, he says. He seemed to be constantly pushing that envelope in terms of lewdness, willing to challenge the mores of middle-class white America. Interestingly, he was actually arrested for conspiracy to produce pornography, I believe, with a young actress named Lorraine Belcher. Structurally, the first part of the album is scathing satirical parodies that question assumptions made about pop music and the burgeoning subculture at the time. One critic pointed out that Zappa was capable of replicating the pop music he despised merely to satirize it. He was certainly a strange one. I think it was the New York Times that said he was half angry beatnik hipster and half loopy Mad Magazine satirist. But it was the interesting article by James Borders that said that this album delivers a message effectively of the injustice, chaos and stupidity of contemporary American society. And the Mothers were certainly not above ridiculing the current audience they were playing to, often employing faux Mexican accents and faux African American accents. You certainly wouldn't get away with doing that now. But the satirical weapon of choice was musical pastiche, I think, or musical parody. With its odd vocal harmonies, doo-wop and R&B ballads were all lampooned. All those manufactured musical fads of American society were fair game. Not all critics, of course, were on board with this album. I think it was Pete Johnson of the Los Angeles Times that described it as musical gibberish. The Mothers of Invention devote a full 4 sides to their type of artistry. The album is the greatest stimulus to the aspirin industry since income tax. Tom Wilson, of course, was the producer of this album. He'd produced Bob Dylan and Simon and Garfunkel. When he heard what they were doing, he phoned the record company and said, "This is definitely not R&B." He was actually quite proud of securing more money for this monstrosity, as he called it. Some people have described this as the first rock concept album, which is up for debate, I suppose. Wikipedia have said that it's a sardonic force about rock music and America. So maybe there's some meat to that particular sandwich. This was, of course, released as a double album in the USA. Zappa wanted this album, he negotiated for this double album to be priced as a single album, effectively waiving his royalties for the second disc. But in the UK, it was only released as a single album, so we got kind of a bum deal there, I think. Early pressings of this album actually came with a hotspots map, which showed all the kind of freak scene hangouts of Los Angeles, as well as a letter from Susie Cream Cheese. The voice of Susie Cream Cheese was Janine Versois, I believe. I hope I've said that right. Although various actresses would play the part of Susie Cream Cheese during live performances. Zappa and the Mothers played the Fillmore. I can't remember if it was Fillmore East or West, I'm not sure, but they were certainly on the bill, but probably Fillmore East. They were on the bill after the invitation from Andy Warhol to open for the Velvet Underground. He wasn't impressed with the Velvet Underground and spent a lot of time, even on stage, slagging them off, saying that those guys suck, which led to a history of handbags in the music press between Lou Reed and Zappa. Many people have argued that Zappa is incredibly cruel, unnecessarily so in his treatment of people and individual foibles, I suppose. Interestingly, his biographer Barry Miles said that Zappa is a cold nihilist who felt no real emotions for anyone. He also said his cynicism and misanthropy was noted, and that in fact Zappa was stuck in some sort of 1950s time warp. In terms of the songs on the album, of course, my favourites are Motherly Love and Ain't Got No Heart, which sounds suspiciously like 8 Miles High by the Byrds. Hungry Freak's Daddy has that fuzz guitar driven riff, which is supposed to be a parody of the Stones' Satisfaction. And Who Are the Brain Police, which is a song that's even more pertinent in the day and age that we live in now, but it was in part a tribute to Lenny Bruce, a figure that Zappa much admired. Motherly Love is an anthemic number that takes on the strange world of the groupie scene. There was a track that wasn't on this album called Groupie Gangbang. The record company was never going to allow that onto this record, but it's on YouTube, you can check it out. There's also a song that mimics the proto-bubblegum pop of Paul Revere and the Raiders, who regularly headlined the Dick Clark's afternoon television show. Trouble Every Day is a famous one. It was inspired by the Watts Riot. The Watts Riot is a district of Los Angeles, I believe. 6 days of civil unrest took place.
I'm about to get sick. You're watching my TV, checking out the news. There's no way to delay that trouble coming every day. No way.
And I'm a Rock is a nod to the Simon and Garfunkel number. Love it or hate it, this album is very special as far as I'm concerned. It's an influential record. Maybe the first rock concept album if you want to go down that road. And as I've said, I'm not sure it's the most important album in the 1960s, but it's certainly up there in the general ballpark. It certainly needs to be a part of that conversation. Anyway, we've been watching an episode of Classic Album Review. If you haven't already, please do click like, subscribe, and do check that notification bell. It makes all the difference to the YouTube algorithm and helps this channel to grow. Check some of the links below this video for ways you can support the sterling work done here. And other than that, I just hope you're well, you're staying safe, and of course that you keep listening.